Welcome back to another one of your flipped lectures. Today we're going to talk about foreign policy in the United States in the world. When we talk about foreign policy, what we're talking about is the relationship the U.S. has with other countries, allies, enemies, and pretty much everything in between. Foreign policy is going to involve things like trade, military conflict, as well as diplomacy and negotiations with those countries. And that diplomacy can take the form of treaties, agreements between countries, or agreements to trade. And the United States' status in the world has changed quite a bit since 1776. From the founding of the country to about the Civil War, America was like a mid-tier power. But then after the Civil War, industrialization made the United States very, very powerful. And they began a project of imperialism, where the United States went out in the world and actually conquered territories. The World Wars saw the United States emerge as a real superpower that would have a big impact on the history of not only kind of the country, but of the entire world. And after the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two most powerful countries in the world by far, known as superpowers. And for about 1991 to the current day, the United States is far and away the most powerful and influential country in the world. Although recently in the 2010s, we've seen a lot of other nations challenge the United States' supremacy in the world. And one concept that has informed Americans' experience of the world is an idea called American exceptionalism. And this is the idea that the United States is unique or exceptional among all the countries of the world. When Americans say they are unique, they say that the ideals of the country, such as freedom, equality, and individualism, make the United States unique. They also say the United States uses their power for good, that the United States is a force for good in the world. Others claim that the United States has a moral superiority, and that the United States has a mission to spread the American ideals like liberty and our morality to other countries of the world. And people will point to the history of the United States, the uniqueness of American government in the world, its unique history, its size, its culture, as well as our ideas of liberty, inalienable rights, and popular sovereignty as reasons why America is exceptional in the world and therefore should act in a certain way unique from the rest of the world. And American exceptionalism is this idea that it's a country shining upon a hill, that is the example to the rest of the world of a great society. A great propaganda photo from World War II shows this idea that Americans will always fight for liberty, and that America is a force for good and right in the world. Now, there's some problems with American exceptionalism. The U.S. is unique in some ways, and some of their actions have been a good and just use of power. But at the same time, actions of the U.S. government at home and in the world haven't really always matched the ideals of the country. We can look at discrimination in history, the Trail of Tears, Indian removal, slavery, Japanese internment, and we can also look at interventions in Latin America, in the Middle East, and political and economic interference in other countries to say that maybe the United States really isn't so unique. It's a debate about kind of America's place in the world and how Americans should view themselves. But this idea of American exceptionalism means that Americans will appeal to this unique idea when they deal with other countries in the world. So how do countries relate to each other? There's a couple of ways. The first is economics. Countries simply conduct trade with each other. Buying avocados from Mexico is an example of economics in terms of foreign policy. Politics. Countries are going to struggle for power and influence over a region, a border, or scarce resources. These politics between countries can be either peaceful or violent, resulting in wars. And culture. All countries export culture, and countries with common cultures, such as the United States and Great Britain, will tend to find easier alliances along those lines. And so here are some quick important terms. The first is international trade. It is simply just trade between people in different countries. The balance of trade refers to the ratio of imports, stuff that you buy from a country and you bring into your country, and exports, stuff that you sell to another country. You want to have a positive ratio of imports to exports because then you essentially are going to make, a ratio of exports to imports so that your country is making money off of this trade. A tariff is a tax on a traded item. This is partially why things that come from other countries are more expensive, because you have to pay a special tax to buy something that comes from somewhere else. And finally, with trade, embargo is a restriction on trade with a particular country, like the one the United States has historically had on Cuba. 3 other quick terms dealing with the way countries relate to each other. First is a treaty, which is simply a formal agreement between 2 countries. The next one is a sphere of influence, which is an area in which a particular country can influence what happens even though it doesn't actually control it. So the United States has a sphere of influence in North America, because what happens in the U.S. is going to affect both Mexico and Canada. And then finally, interdependency. And this is when 2 or more countries' economies are linked in a way that makes each country dependent on the other. So for instance, if the United States couldn't produce any oil, they would be interdependent with countries that are going to sell that oil. And so what happens in the world is going to shape U.S. history quite a lot. The world wars are a very good example of this, where wars that start in Europe end up bringing the United States in. But also, things like the Great Famine in Ireland are going to cause high amounts of immigration that are going to shape American demographics. And what happens in the U.S. is going to start to shape the world. Things like the Mexican-American War, Hollywood movies, and even inventions like a better process for making steel are going to reshape the entire world sphere. So the last piece for foreign policy is the 2 competing ideas about what the United States should do in the world: isolationism and internationalism. Isolationism is the belief that a country should stay out of the internal conflicts and international conflicts of countries. And so the United States at times has tried to stay out of the world's affairs, isolating themselves from the rest of the world. Internationalism is the belief that a country needs to be involved in world affairs and working with other nations in order to protect kind of global interests. At times, the U.S. has been very involved in world affairs and the development of other countries. But the role of the United States' leadership in the world has been controversial, and we'll look at that as well. So, on the whole, foreign policy involves the United States dealing with other countries of the world. What happens in the world is going to affect the history of the United States, and the history of the United States is going to come to have a big impact on the rest of the world.